Good morning, and welcome to the UBC Learning Circle. We're excited to be here today to welcome you to our first dialogue in this series, Challenging Ideology, looking at historical museum practices through an Indigenous lens. Joining us in the Learning Circle are Erica Hernandez Reid, Jordan Wilson, Genevieve Hill, and Melissa Adams to share their experiences and perspectives. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to acknowledge that we are at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples, for which we are very grateful to be an invited guest here at UBC. I would encourage you to acknowledge and share in the chat the territory from which you are joining us today. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle, the BC Museums Association for funding this webinar, and Kristen Koshy from the Residential School History and Dialogue Center for visioning and organizing this event. Also, this is a gentle reminder that the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point you feel you need to talk to a friend, an elder, a counselor, or a family member, don't hesitate to do so. We've also included some resources in the chat, and we'll continue to post those throughout the webinar if you feel you need to access those. I'm Elizabeth Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia, and I'll be facilitating the webinar series. I would also like to introduce Kristen Koshy, who is the project coordinator and visioner of this event. Kristen is a member of the Hlutsum First Nation and served on council for 6 years. She has completed an MLIS degree with a concentration in First Nations curriculum in 2018 and has previously worked at what was formerly known as UBC Aboriginal Health and with Chinook Foundation on a project where she researched and analyzed how to use blockchain technology to give Indigenous peoples and communities autonomy over their own records. Kristen has been a keynote speaker at the ACA on the topic of data sovereignty for Indigenous sovereignty. She currently is the co-lead of the oral testimony program at the Residential School History and Dialogue Center and works primarily with research and engagement at the center. Kristen believes interpersonal relationships, sharing influence, and having a willingness to learn and cultural humility are imperative for work with Indigenous communities, individuals, and content. It's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists who will be speaking today. Melissa Adams is the librarian and archivist at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and she is a member of the Nisga'a Nation from the House of Wilshin Weelik of the Gitxsan or Killer Whale tribe. Apologies, Melissa, for her education background includes history, First Nation studies, and archival studies, and she completed the Aboriginal training program in museum practices at the Canadian Museum of History. She has previously worked at government, religious, educational, and private libraries and archives. Welcome, Melissa. Jordan Wilson is an emerging curator and writer and is currently a PhD student in anthropology at New York University. He is a member of the Musqueam First Nation. Prior to starting graduate studies, Wilson was a curatorial intern at the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery from 2017 to 2018. He holds an MA in anthropology with a focus on critical museum studies and a BA in First Nation studies, now First Nations and Indigenous studies, both obtained at the University of British Columbia. Wilson was a co-curator of the exhibit Cessnam, the City Before the City in 2015, and In a Different Light, Reflecting a Northwest Coast Art 2017 at the UBC Museum of Anthropology. Welcome, Jordan. Genevieve earned a BA in Greek and Roman, Genevieve Hill earned a BA in Greek and Roman Studies and Anthropology from the University of Victoria and an MA and a PhD in Archaeology from the University of Exeter in the UK. Over the past 20 years, she has worked on curatorial sites throughout the south coast of BC, the UK, Greece, and Turkey as an academic and professional archaeologist. She is currently the BC Archaeology Collections Manager and a researcher in the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department at the Royal BC Museum. In this role, she cares for cultural belongings recovered from archaeological contexts and facilitates the repatriation of cultural belongings and ancestors to their descendant communities. Welcome, Genevieve. Erica Hernandez Reid, our fourth panelist, is from the Northern BC, is head of the Northern BC Archives and Special Collections at the University of Northern British Columbia. She holds a master's degree in archival studies from the University of British Columbia, and for the past 20 years has focused her work on a participatory and community archiving approach to knowledge building. Erica is co-chair of the response to the report to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Task Force, member of the Digitization Program Steering Committee, and president of the Association of Canadian Archivists starting this year, 2021 through 2023. Thank you, Erica. I would like to now ask each panelist to share a little bit about themselves before we move forward. Should we start with Melissa?
We can do that. So Amasa, good day to you all. And I'm very happy to be here and talking about this very important topic, because it's certainly something I faced some challenges in over the years as an Indigenous person. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about my background and where I am now, and kind of a couple of stumbles I had along the way, and we'll get that out of the way first. So I did my undergrad with a double major in history and First Nation studies at the University of Northern BC, with the intention of going into something kind of heritage, Indigenous knowledge related when I graduated. And that's one of the first challenges I kind of found, is that in the GLAM galleries, libraries, archives, museums world, we're very good at siloing things into library practices or archival practices or museum practices. And whereas that's not necessarily an Indigenous way of thinking. So I chose an archives library path, and only lasted a semester during my first attempt at my master's degree. I was expecting, I think going into it, this is a number of years ago now, more Indigenous content, more from Indigenous perspective, whereas when I did it, it was very kind of Western. This is what archives are. This is a kind of almost linear history of how libraries and archives developed. Mistakes were made, I think, on my part, and also how we dealt with it in the program. And I ended up withdrawing after a semester, did some other stuff, including the training program at the what was then the Canadian Museum of History, and came back and did the Master of Archival Studies degree at UBC with the First Nations curriculum concentration there. So took some library and records management stuff as well. However, coming out of that, I found going through the program somehow in my head, I kind of came out of it with a very binary view, like archives and Western archives are one thing and Indigenous knowledge is important, but something else over there, and not something archives are as concerned with. So I guess after that, I had to do some unlearning, learning, decolonization, all those words on my own. And also something that has really helped me is just being involved with my own culture, especially here in Vancouver, because it's a very big Nisga'a population. So I was able to participate in a dance group, take language classes, make regalia, spend time with my family that's down here, as well as traveling home sometimes. So it's my journey, I think, it has not been straightforward. But I'm still here. I still think the GLAM world is important and I want to be involved with it, but there have been stumbling blocks along the way. So, and I appreciate that we are here to talk about that, because for a number of years, this wasn't something I was comfortable discussing or being open about. Yeah, I felt like it was kind of my fault and I had to figure out how to change to fit into it. But yeah, there is definitely more discussion happening nowadays. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to take part in that discussion today.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for such a generous introduction and for sharing that. I know there are many of us in the field who feel as though we stand on the shoulders of folks like yourself who come before us and really help to face some of those challenges and pave the way for the conversations we're having now. So much gratitude there. I'm going to move to Jordan Wilson if he would like to introduce himself next and share.
Hi, everyone. As mentioned in my bio, I'm from Musqueam and started my education, my post-secondary education at UBC in Indigenous studies, which is interdisciplinary. I think I've been really fortunate to have my training both academically and professionally at the Museum of Anthropology and at UBC, given the close relationship that the museum and the university has with my own community, given the close proximity of UBC to our reserve and the increasing recognition that UBC occupies our ancestral territory. And yeah, like, I guess, you know, my introduction to the world of museum work really just kind of, it was something that I just kind of fell into when I was a relatively aimless undergrad, not knowing what I wanted to do, but interested in knowing more about Musqueam history and Musqueam culture and issues that affect us as Indigenous people. And basically, I was offered a summer job by Susan Rowley, who's a curator at MOA. And I really had no idea what I was in for. I was just kind of told to show up at her office on Monday, sort of thing. And that was back in 2009 when the museum was undergoing its renewal project, major renovation and expansion, and redesigning of its permanent galleries. So yeah, that was my exposure to that. And for me, it was fulfilling to work at this interface between the institution and community, particularly Musqueam, but other Coast Salish communities as well. And yeah, learning about issues around representation, around the complexities of historical collections in terms of how they were collected, how they ended up in museums, what does it mean for them to be in museums now, what sort of knowledge do these things hold, how are community members engaging with these types of materials, what are the priorities for communities today in terms of representation to a public audience. And so yeah, that was kind of my start, and from there I kind of fell into the discipline of anthropology as well, which is something that I didn't really pursue. Good morning, Willie. Thanks for joining. It's nice to see so many viewers from across Canada, and I saw someone was even tuning in from Paris, France. So that's really, yeah, really exciting. So thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, and then I've worked on a couple of projects that maybe I will have a chance to speak more about as the discussion progresses. But that's a little bit about who I am and why I'm here.
Thanks so much, Jordan, again, for that generously sharing that. It's exciting to be having this conversation right now in this space. So thank you for joining us. I'll move next to Genevieve Hill to share a little bit about herself and introduce herself.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to be speaking with all of these really professional individuals with diverse experience in the GLAM sector. I am speaking to you today from the Songhees and Esquimalt territories, and I just want to give a shout out also to the Lely Dene, where I was born, and Cowichan Valley, where I was raised. And so my interactions there really helped shape where I've ended up. I am the descendant of British colonists to the east and to more recent British folks coming here to BC. And I have a pretty diverse background when it comes to the GLAM sector. So I started out, as you said, in Greek and Roman studies, fell in love with archaeology and did as much of it as I could everywhere that I could, and started work specifically in the consulting world while I was going to grad school. And it's there that I really fell in love with waterlogged archaeological sites, which happen all over the world, but which aren't really aren't as well known here as they are in Europe. So then I went over there and did some more training, and came back, worked as a consultant, worked in the archaeology branch, and then came to the museum as collection manager. And so, you know, it's not the most straightforward path, but I feel really lucky to have had all of those experiences, because what I've learned over the years is that you know, archaeology in the province of BC and across Canada was slower to take off than in other parts of the world. The reasons why people were doing archaeology were you know, stuck in those old mindsets of having to preserve things as they were. Even our legislation out here in British Columbia is pretty limiting when it comes to understanding Indigenous experience on the landscape. We'll probably get into that a little bit later. But here at the museum, it's really important to know that although this is one of the biggest collections in the province, because the museum's been around for over 130 years, it's just important for people to understand that the way that material comes here now through the commercial process, through archaeological repositories, is largely separate and cut off. And so I feel in a unique position to sort of bring those back together and to help students understand that the material that they will eventually work on is not, it doesn't come here to just sort of sit on a box on a shelf, but that they actually go back to communities, that communities come and see the belongings of their ancestors, and that this is no longer a place where things just go to hang around. It's actually, I mean, in non-COVID times, it's a bit of a social gathering place where people can come and be with the objects and take belongings home and things like that. So I'm excited to talk with all of you about the opportunities that we can look at going forward, and to really name and address some of the things that have gone on in this sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, and for sharing that experience and giving us some context of the situation and where you are at RBCM. Much appreciated. And finally, but certainly not least, is Erica Hernandez Reid, who I would welcome to do a brief introduction as well. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, where the two rivers meet in Prince George, BC. I too am honored to be with you all. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. There's such diverse experience and perspective today on this panel, and I'm really excited to participate. A little bit about myself. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a daughter and an auntie. I acknowledge my privilege in being the head of archives for a university. It has allowed me the opportunity to engage in work that I love. And it wasn't until I was actually able to start my term at UNBC that I was able to actually engage my passions of archives and supporting Indigenous sovereignty. So it's been a tremendous ride for me over the past, I don't even know how many years, 15 years at UNBC. It's been a long time. I started off my academic career in anthropology as well at UBC with full intent of becoming a globe-trotting anthropologist. I wanted to see the world and learn all about different cultures, but then I realized that I came to my own conclusion that I didn't really have a right to do that, that it was best left to people to present themselves as they so wished. And so I went to grad school, and I recall doing a paper on looking at Tlingit orality and identifying the aspects of a record in terms of diplomatics. And that to me just kind of poked a hole in, as Melissa said, there was just a distinct lack of Indigenous worldview in archives years ago. So that was a really interesting exercise for me, and it kind of pointed the way for me going forward in terms of my passion. So that's kind of where I started and where I've ended up in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you all again for really generously sharing and contextualizing your positions here as we start the dialogue. So the webinar, this first one, will provide input into what it means to, decolonize museums, and more broadly, the GLAM sector from an academic perspective. Note, this panelist session will represent perspectives rather than concrete answers, and is in a coffee table dialogue format. So I'll pose that first question and leave you all to chat. And so, as a professional working with Indigenous content, what has been your personal experience in the GLAM sector? And if you're just joining us, the GLAM sector is galleries, libraries, archives, and museums as a shorthand for how it's often defined. So as a professional working in the Indigenous content, with Indigenous content, what has been your personal experience in the GLAM sector regarding exclusion or inclusion? Thank you.
I can start with adding something, I guess, something really specific with regard to inclusion, exclusion, because I've already talked about my personal history there, but I was thinking recently that one of the really kind of powerful and supportive actions or things that have been done that have helped me here is seeing other Indigenous people and other Black people of color also participating in this sector. When I was doing my second attempt at my master's, I had the Society of American Archivists had a funding opportunity to bring together a group of Indigenous archivists to the SAA, Society of American Archivists conference for 2 years in a row. So just seeing and being with other people in the sector was really important. And when I was in that in-between time, between when my first attempt at my master's and the second one, when I was at the Canadian Museum of History, just being able to see Indigenous people there who were conservators, curators, in collections management. Personally, that's definitely one of the things that has kept me here. So having those kind of cohorts has been very important to me.
I will jump in and just say it's been really interesting to watch the archives community evolve over the last 7 odd years, I think. Prior to that, I don't recall any consideration at all being given to Indigenous content, to Indigenous inclusion of Indigenous colleagues, to looking at Indigenous perspectives in light of archival practice. But I think that we are at an interesting point in time when finally people are starting to understand that they can no longer, it is no longer okay, it never was, but it is no longer tolerable, it's no longer acceptable to exclude people from the profession, from descriptive practices, from archival practice. It is not acceptable anymore. And that's been a really interesting thing to witness. I'm so grateful to have witnessed that. It's prior to that, it was often for me like talking to a blank wall. When talking to archivists at conferences that didn't even know what territory they were on, didn't have a clue where they were situated, didn't understand their privilege, didn't look at their descriptions in any sort of critical light, had no attempt or gave no attempt to relationship build with the communities represented in their holdings. It was disturbing, to say the least, but I'm seeing this pattern, this momentum building, and it's very slow, but the fact that the ball is rolling is huge because I've found, like Melissa was saying, archival theory and practice really was rooted in like a European kind of tradition. And so to introduce that colonial understanding, to unpack that, has been required quite a push. So it's kind of an exciting time right now. I think it's a time to be critical and vocal, and I love hearing that critical engagement with within our own profession and across the GLAM sector.
I'm going to jump in on that because I've noticed a lot of the same things happening here in the museum sector and in the archaeology sector. The archaeology, sorry, for everyone else, is just sort of an added bonus onto this GLAM thing. So the first thing that I would say is that certainly in museums and also in archaeology, people seem to treat Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous opportunities as sort of like a bonus. Like there's, a lot of similarities. If any of you in the audience are artists and you hear people say like, well, you love what you do, so you must want to do it for free all the time. There's often the notion that the change that's needed is just giving people opportunities, but people don't think about how you need to pay people for those opportunities and pay for their cultural knowledge. There's also, it goes hand in hand with this, the old assumptions that if you don't have a Western academic degree in your hands, that you can't be paid the same amount as somebody who has one or more. And I think that that has done a huge disservice to our understanding and interpretation and appreciation of the material that we possess in a museum like this. And I think that I'm really glad to say that in the more recent years that I've started to see some positive change in that, but I do acknowledge that there's still a very long way to go to make these opportunities both attractive to people that possess that cultural knowledge, and to do that opportunity justice, to do those opportunities justice. I'm optimistic, but there's still lots of room for improvement.
I appreciate that Elizabeth included a disclaimer that we weren't going to have any concrete answers to these questions. So for me, the question in some ways just raises more questions for me in terms of, well, I suppose like this question around inclusion and exclusion like is premised on a like power dynamic that, or maybe, it's premised on a power dynamic and maybe doesn't challenge that relationship as much, because I question like who is doing the including and who's doing the excluding, and like is inclusion something that's desirable, or is it a matter of like how do we transform these spaces and institutions so that that's no longer the question. And I think like also this, like the question of inclusion, thinking about the changes that even I've observed over the past 10 years, for example, like an increasing demand or desire to include Indigenous voices and perspectives, or an increasing desire to like decolonize or reconcile, and that while a positive development also has its own like baggage or complexities in terms of what is being asked and what sort of labor is being expected of communities, and how do we attend to that as well, because it feels like, a very almost drastic change from exclusion to wanting to include. And I just, like, from what I've observed, that not all communities have the same level of capacity to respond to those kinds of requests. So that's something that's kind of, been, I suppose, has been on my mind through the work that I've taken part in. And I guess also, working from within institutions or institutionally based projects, also being on the asking side, and wanting to use projects as a platform for to further Indigenous voice and agendas. So that's kind of what comes to my mind, but it probably does not answer the questions, but maybe just kind of like leads to more questions that don't really have clear answers.
I think you bring up a really good point, Jordan, talking about the power dynamic. I thought, for me, that's almost like that's the crux of the exclusion inclusion argument. Who is privileged enough to enact the exclusion or inclusion? I in my work, it's something that I've been thinking about is, we're encouraging archives to consider, working with Indigenous communities who may be represented within that archives, to look at proper description, to look at determining access protocols and appropriate use of materials. However, there's also the question of repatriation of materials. Should you be having that material in your archives anyway? Perhaps it shouldn't be yours in the first place. But I think it also comes down to a question of money. In GLAM, I find money is just like this underpinning structural support that doesn't really get, it gets talked about a lot, but it's just not available. I think for me, it's been really interesting to watch communities around me set up their own cultural centers or gearing up to set up their own cultural centers that include museum or artifact, library, and archival materials, among other things, other forms of cultural expression. And I would just like to, obviously, I would like to see more money. I would like to see more money available so that, there's not the question of inclusion, exclusion. It's a question of, does that community want to set up its own archives and set up its, its own club? You know what I mean? Like, so you don't have archives and libraries and museums all siloed off. Like, it's that inclusion or exclusion becomes moot because it's set, the community sets its own terms. Do you know what I mean? And so the community then is in a position to manage whatever materials they have according to whatever protocols they wish. But for me, it comes down to that money. So as an archivist, I can support, community management of their own materials, but I don't have that capacity to financially provide that infrastructure that is so needed. And it comes down to power as well. It's not like archives have a lot of money anyway, but still.
And just the whole financial situation is just a challenging thing, especially because for a lot of institutions in this sector, it's the funding that is out there is so much project-based stuff rather than sustainable, ongoing funding, which makes it challenging in that it's shorter term while challenging in a number of ways. Speaking in the funding area, one often it is that funding for projects is coming from non-Indigenous organizations. So there are all the rules around what you can do with the material and that kind of thing. Like one of the projects that, or one of the funding areas that the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has certainly looked to is the indigenization program, because, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, but the First Nations community or organization is the one who gets to decide whether the material is made, that is digitized through that program, is made public. And so many other funding bodies, there are stipulations saying that if you're using this money to do this, then it has to be public. Just, yeah, making funding available without enforcing decisions from outside the community on the community is a big deal. I had another thought about funding, but it disappeared, so I will be quiet now.
Yeah, speaking of funding, I definitely feel like the funding sources need to themselves take a look at what sort of things they're offering, because with a lot of work in repatriation, there are tiny pockets of money that appear every once in a while, and even there, occasionally there's a big pocket of money. But for things like ancestral remains repatriation, it's not enough just to say that they're funding a project for that if things like the costs for the funerals for the ancestors to go home are not included in that. So I think there needs to be a lot of work on how these funding programs are designed, and how the funders who are giving the money, what parameters they put on it. There really needs to be sustained funding. We see that also in the issue of archaeological repositories, that there's a lack of both support for repositories on the logistical side, but also ongoing funding. And a lot of smaller repositories have those little tiny pockets of funding that may or may not string together, and that's just not enough, not good enough.
That's what a fantastic conversation to start us off. And there's some real themes that continually rise here around, and how we define inclusion. And I think I really appreciate it is that the institutions themselves need to transform. I'd love to circle back, if we have time, to the idea of unlearning, right? That idea that was surfaced here, and funding and resources, and again kind of comes back to that transformation of institutions and systems. And so some fantastic themes. Thank you all. We'll move to our next question now that I'll put to our panelists. So what have been some of the most impactful changes you've personally or professionally seen in the GLAM sector regarding inclusion, exclusion? I think you've started to touch on those, but I wonder if you want to get into things that maybe you've seen actually make an impact in the area, or things that maybe you're working towards specifically or collectively to move these things forward. Thank you.
I'll just go really quickly to say that my colleagues, my Indigenous colleagues, Lucy Bell and Luann Neal, and other Indigenous colleagues and staff at the museum were lucky enough to participate in the development of a repatriation handbook, which was written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people who've had this experience and who are going forward to have further experiences like this. And Luann and Michelle Washington, who I work with, are constantly revising that, getting feedback from community members who are experiencing this. And so to me, that is a really big positive move, to have the Indigenous voice leading the way.
I think, well, one of the things for me is just seeing that you can change things to better fit Indigenous needs. So for example, at the Union of BC Indigenous Library, we do use the Brian Deere classification system, which is much more tailored to Indigenous needs and, how do I say this, less offensive than some of the other classifications out there like Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress. So we don't have Indigenous peoples classified in the section that's primarily focused on history, for example, and we put nations next to each other on the shelves rather than alphabetically, and we have our subject areas are ones that are a lot more useful to us, and because the way Brian Deere classification works is that each library can tailor it to their organization's needs. We are able to do that more detailed focus on rights and title or governance, BC First Nations, because we do Union of BC Indigenous Chiefs does specific claims research for BC First Nations. I think we have a subject area that's Indigenous. I think it's response and renewal, which I really like. And that it's also designed to be kind of a classification system that's simple enough that you don't need a whole bunch of training to be able to use it, which is useful for me since I don't actually have a master's of library science or a library tech degree. And doing that tailoring can be sort of contrary to the consistency that the wider library community may want. And I've seen that come out, is that everything, like the systems should be kind of transferable between different libraries, different institutions. And whereas with our system, we do things to best suit our users' needs. And maybe it's more challenging to link into the wider system, but if that wider system is going to be more challenging or more offensive, that's not something that we want to be doing anyway. So being able to do that, I'm happy I work here and that we can do that too.
Sorry, I just neglected to give my thanks also for Nika Collison, who was the person who steered the repatriation handbook. So sorry, Nika. Thank you for all your work.
I find that kind of a challenging question to consider. I think my mind kind of goes to these broader developments that we've witnessed, over the past 10 years or so in Canada and beyond, in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I feel like institutions are really looking at those frameworks now and thinking about how they can respond to those and incorporate those within their infrastructure and within their policies. And I think, I guess, for example, even something like the Indigenous Languages Act and the money that's being, dedicated towards Indigenous language revitalization, I feel like these efforts will also lead to a transformation in how the GLAM sector works and how it's engaged by communities. So I think, or even something like the First Peoples Cultural Council, I think these are things that, lead me to feel more hopeful about the possibilities of decolonization in this sector. Whereas, I don't know, even 10 years ago, I'm not really sure people within the museum sector were really considering something like, like United Nations Declaration, or like how these sort of like broader political developments impact them. And I think I'm just, like even quite like, I feel like over the past several years, there is more questioning around like expertise, like Erica's introduction talking about like wanting to be an anthropologist and changing her mind, and realizing that maybe, I guess that the times have changed in terms of like expertise around knowledge. And so I think those are sort of like the like broader developments that I've observed that are a bit hard to like, I guess like pinpoint on a micro level, but I think are definitely influencing the course of how these institutions operate.
Sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, jumping off of that, yes, I agree with what people have been saying, that there's definitely been that shift in discussion on that. It's actually being talked about in terms since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. I also think that it has been challenging, that inclusion as institutions are trying to figure out how to do this, because so I kind of feel like places are used to operating on, say, like certain schedules and timelines, and there's not that inclusion for that relationship building. And when you have had a previous relationship that either is not involved Indigenous people in any meaningful way, or and then suddenly there is a switch, which complicating things is also money attached to that. We have, I think, I know of a number of people in different Indigenous people in different sectors who have found suddenly they're being approached by other individuals or groups or institutions, non-Indigenous groups or institutions, wanting to collaborate and coming to them with projects they already have far in development, and the time hasn't been built to develop the relationship and find out what Indigenous communities and organizations actually want and need. And it can be challenging to, how do you involve relationship building into work plans and that kind of thing. So it's good we're talking about it, but how is still being figured out in that shift in perspective.
I totally agree with you. Relationship building is the crux here, I think, of so much future development and engagement but it's very difficult to put into a timeline. And I don't know, I have a strange sense of humor, and it kind of makes me laugh thinking of these institutions, these non-Indigenous institutions, trying to conceptualize relationship building when they can come off as being so cold and rigid, and you're not a person, you're just an employee, and all of this stuff. So anyway, one thing I wanted to, well, a couple of things I wanted to mention in terms of impactful changes that I've seen in the profession. I want to give a shout out first to the Yukon Council of Archives. They've done a lot of really tremendous work over the past several years in terms of understanding their membership base and changing their kind of service model to meet the needs of the Indigenous archivists and records keepers, information professionals of the region. And they successfully got funding to fund a traveling archivist that actually goes around the territory and offers services on a kind of an on-demand basis. So I think that's tremendous. I think right now, and I can't speak for them in terms of numbers, but I think pretty close to 3/4 of their membership is now Indigenous, and you can really tell by the events that they hold and the services and resources that they provide that they really are meeting the needs of the community where the community is at. And I think that is really important. For me, that's pretty amazing. I think that's great. As well, a couple of impactful changes that I've been really pleased to see. So at the Northern BC Archives, we've had for a number of years a few MOUs with regional First Nations communities, wherein we agree to care and store a nation's archival material. It's usually audiovisual, something that's really kind of fragile in terms of the physical stability. We provide a home for the material, but we do not provide access. The access is still provided by the community. So if a community member comes and wants to view, a certain videotape, audio tape from this material, they have to obtain permission first to do so. And so this is a model. It's been great. It's worked well. It's still being used successfully by several nations. But what I'm delighted to see now is that communities are setting up their own archives, and it's moved more from like a physical caretaker situation to a full-on collegial situation where, I go into communities and we talk shop. And I love that. I think that's great. I think that's tremendous. That, the archives is being developed on the terms of the community itself. And they are caring for things in a way, making them accessible that works for them. And I that is something that I hadn't seen, 15 years ago when I first started. So this, for me, kind of speaks to that sense of understanding maybe the value of archival material that exists, and the value in terms of not preserving it for the past, but using it for the future, right? So for language development, for curriculum development, really understanding the value of that. That's been really amazing to witness. So those are just a couple of the changes that have really been incredible for me during my time in this profession.
I think another shift that I've seen, not immediately Indigenous related, but definitely Indigenous related, is the willingness to talk more about the role of emotion in our practices, and both how that affects who we're working with and how it affects ourselves. Just as an example, I guess about 12 years ago now, I worked for the federal government archives, and one of the things that was taking up a lot of our time then was looking through residential records for people's names, people who had contacted the archives wanting copies of their records. And just because of the way archives are organized, it isn't a means of just typing in someone's name and then finding the records. You actually had to physically sit down with files and just look through these records looking for individual names. And one of the things I came across as I was doing this one day was a letter that would have been sent from the school to the parents or guardians, just caretakers, saying that it's that time of year again, time to get your kids ready to go back to school, residential school, and have them waiting at the spot on the state. And I mean, it's a kind of innocuous letter, but also it was one that came from the school that many of my family members would have attended, and it was the right date, that it's something that my grandmother may very well have received. And it just, yeah, even now, I feel it. And I certainly reacted to it then, but at the time, I didn't feel like I could take a break or talk to somebody about this. I kind of felt like I just had to, this was my job. I had to suck it up and deal. And like I said, this was, 11, 12 years ago. I would not handle that situation the same way today. And the way I handled that situation was sit at my desk crying over the records and not talking to anyone about it. But there was a lot more openness to talk about the trauma that people experience, that we've experienced as Indigenous people. And I think as we talk about Indigenous issues and working with Indigenous people within this field or these fields, we have to recognize that we're dealing with our own things. And I'm also, like I spoke a little bit about before, working on learning more about my culture and learning my language. Like we're dealing with the impacts of colonization, both emotionally and also trying to reclaim all that was taken from us. And so there's a lot more going on than just trying to decolonize the glam world in our lives.
So I know that the Australians are doing some tremendous work in terms of trauma-informed archival practice and support for archivists. And you did note that bringing the emotion, bringing the person and the spirit back into the conversation is really critical. But I think you've pointed out something that very much is still lacking, is that support for Indigenous archivists doing this work, because it's that layer upon layer of trauma. So you can have that vicarious trauma, but there's still, as you pointed out, that connectivity to self that is over and above, I think, that vicarious trauma. I mean, the archives, kind of in my opinion, has almost been like the little sister of museums for a while. I'm wondering, Jordan and Genevieve, if you are aware of any supports that are in place for people in the museum community who are Indigenous and have to deal with that type of layered relationship with the materials that you're working on.
Sadly, very sadly, no, not for me. I work a lot. I mean, I work directly with ancestral remains and with Indigenous colleagues who are working with ancestral remains, and there's not enough support. There's not enough support, and there desperately needs to be. And I know if anyone has tips on how to make that happen, it's so important, but it's not there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my mind could be blanking right now, but I feel like the support that I've accessed has really been on an informal level. I think there is like a pretty strong sense of community amongst Indigenous peoples who work in the art world and the museum world. I think there's a lot of connections there. I've heard so many great things about the ATOM conferences, but I've yet to make it to one of those. But I think it's like through those types of connection, like, yeah, developing like a network of peers in Canada and beyond, that has been rewarding for me. And like, it's been in those informal spaces where I feel like I've in some ways learned the most, like through conversations with friends who are curators and artists who are thinking through similar issues. And also for me, like my support has been with my community, and particularly yeah, like family members who have also engaged these institutions. So, and yeah, and like the issues that we are confronted with. So that's been my experience, but there's no like I can't think of like formal settings or context or training, I suppose, that I've engaged with.
Thank you so much. I'll jump in here if that's okay. I don't want to interrupt anyone. I think that, again, some of these themes, and one thing that struck me by a number of what you've been talking about this last round of questions, is really this moment in time. It seems like there's quite a shift happening that is long overdue, from what I'm understanding that many of you are saying, and that this idea of this, I love that expression, network of peers, you know, those community connections, that community of practice, can potentially be elevated in the context of the frameworks that now are really front and center for folks like UNDRIP, TRC calls, you know, a number of other organizations like First Peoples Cultural Council, et cetera, have really, I think, become more on the radar of folks. And so being able to broaden what we think of as the practice and what needs to be included in the practice seems to be coming through in much of what you're saying. But it sounds like the resourcing is still really, really limited and very narrow in its focus. So hopefully we'll have time to revisit that as well. So I'll move to our next question. And I think you've started to discuss this, and hopefully we can continue on with it. So in your opinions, so what are some of the steps the GLAM sector should be taking to confront a colonial structure and systemic racism? So that's kind of big. I'm not asking you to solve all that today. That's a big one. But I know you've been pulling those threads in your conversations, talking about some of the things that are happening, which are heartening and exciting, I think, for professionals tuning in here and community folks who are engaging in this work in really valuable ways. But I wonder, what are some of the things that you would say should be happening? We've touched on that in some of the resourcing and some of the guidelines, but is there more you would say that could be going on, should be going on, to really confront that colonial structure and that systemic racism we know is really at the root of many institutions and practices in our professions? Thank you.
I have a couple of thoughts, which yeah, I don't know if we're going to solve anything, but I think one of the things we do need to be talking about is just acknowledging our history. Part of the work we're talking about, the truth, like we talk about truth and reconciliation, and people want to jump right to the reconciliation without acknowledging the truth. And for archives, for example, which definitely wasn't something I was even thinking about or encountering when I was in archive school, was that we learn about the development of archival theory. So as we're learning about the development of archival theory in Canada, there wasn't any sort of acknowledgement that that's theories developing at the same time that there's very, very active policies and actions being taken to destroy Indigenous knowledge systems and record keeping. So, you know, the potlatch being banned, we can't pass on that knowledge that way and have it witnessed. The dispossession of land by confining people to reserves, the residential school system, and removing kids from families, like all of that is work is there to deliberately destroy Indigenous knowledge systems. And at the same time, or archival theory is being developed in Canada. So thinking what sort of implications could that have had on how we thought about archives, the institutions, for example, this is very archives focused, but because the federal government was responsible or is responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians, there's so many records related to Indigenous people in the archives. So all this information there, and yet at the same time, the government was trying to make us not exist. So just acknowledging that history, that's where we came from. This is how the practices that we're teaching students in schools, that this is part of that history as well. So yeah, that acknowledgement, I think, is that archives are a colonial structure, and actually saying that. And that's sort of one, speaking of the shifts we've seen over the past 10 years, like the protocols for Native American archival materials were developed 2006, I believe, and they initially were not accepted by the Society of American Archivists. And then somebody will have to remind me, a few years ago, they were accepted with the acknowledgement that white supremacy was the reason for them not being previously accepted. So I think we have to get comfortable in our uncomfortableness of actually talking about colonialism and white supremacy and how that's affected how we actually do things.
I totally agree. We need to engage in those uncomfortable situations, the conversations that make people squirm and not really know how to answer. I think that's really important to start that conversation. From my perspective, and again, I apologize for just coming from an archival perspective. It's kind of all I've got, but so from the archival community, I think Elizabeth had mentioned that I'm co-chair of the response to the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission task force. And this task force was set up by the Steering Committee on Canada's Archives in 2016 to respond directly to the call to action number 70. And that talks about a review of national of archival policies and best practices in regards to basically the lack of compliance with UNDRIP and the United Nations Joanette Lencher principles as related to Indigenous people's inalienable right to know the truth about what happened and why with regards to rights violations committed against them in residential schools, and then to produce a report with recommendation for full implementation of these international mechanisms as a reconciliation framework for Canada's archives. So since 2016, we've been working on this, and as part of developing our final report, which I hope will be released, I hope next month. It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure next month it'll be out. Has been kind of, we did an initial survey because, as Melissa pointed out, you kind of have to acknowledge the colonial underpinnings of your own profession to identify what led to what, like what is the impetus for X, Y, and Z. And so we did undertake a survey that was filled out by archives across Canada. And it pinpointed exactly what we knew to be true, that there was a distinct lack of understanding of UNDRIP, of the calls to action, of, there was lack of acknowledgement of or relationships with Indigenous communities wherein archives were situated. We knew this was going to be the result, but we had to do that anyway to kind of create a base point you know, this is a point in time, this is where it was at, and then we can see how we hopefully improve, you know. And I think that is really important, to take that a step back and kind of do a critical assessment of your own institution and your own self, to really look at your overt and unconscious bias, to understand where you know, your, not just your thought patterns, but also your policies, your procedures, your services, your you know, your outreach material. Who are your audience members? You know, like, who are your patrons? And if they don't include Indigenous patrons, well, why not? Like, what is going on? But I think, you know, having that understanding that archives developed as a tool of the colonialist government to record its genocidal actions towards our Indigenous peoples in this country. We have to not embrace that, we have to acknowledge that, right? And understand, when we look at our own holdings, where the silences are at. What is the significance of the silences? Where are the gaps? What are those silences saying? If there's records in there that are on Indigenous communities, yet you don't have any Indigenous patrons coming in, what's the problem with that? Where is that disconnect? You know, why are you not engaging community members directly with this material? And these are really hard, they're hard questions to answer, but I think it's really critical as a step if you're going to move forward on a path towards reconciliation. You need to understand where your truth is, you know, not just on a national scale, but where are you before you can begin anything, make any sort of changes. That's next steps for me.
I also have, in different language, the same thing. I said, name it, name what's going on, call it out and discuss it. And I honestly don't think that the policies can be changed unless it is named. There seems, you know, to be, in archaeology and in an institution like this, there seems to be a hesitancy, reluctance, a lack of, you know, everyone's so busy that taking the time to stop and think about those things is not something that has been put on the schedule by others. So we have to make that time for ourselves. And I also think, you know, specific to archaeology and archaeological repositories around the province, that there is still sort of the, there's still science brain, you know, like science is objective, archaeology is a science, therefore the things that we collect are done so in a scientific manner. We're not looking at things like the act itself that governs, the Heritage Conservation Act that governs how archaeology is conducted in the province, and the way that the act is currently written, both, you know, it says 1846, everything before that is automatically protected and everything after that isn't. So then we're experiencing an erasure of the colonial historic practices that have erased Indigenous ones. And without being able to examine that, you know, it sort of furthers the narrative that, you know, nothing to see here, there's no problems here. So I think that, yeah, this sector not only has to look at itself and its immediate practices and policies, but go back to things that are even underpinning, like, why are we doing archaeology? What are the gaps there? Who is archaeology being done for? And what is the level of recording, and what stories can be told from that? Who is driving that narrative? I think that there's a lot of points that need to be named and discussed there. I also think within the museum sector, there's, as my colleagues talk about healing the collection, so that we have done some work. Tom Child in our collection has been doing some work around bringing in actual community names and not just sort of pan-indigenizing large groups of Indigenous people in the province. And then my colleague Michelle also brought up to me, she brought my attention to the fact that even things that we don't even notice, like the fact that we list people as donors, and how that glorifies, how the language that we use glorifies the donor as if they're doing something good and wonderful by giving it, but we don't ask about how they got it in the first place. Should they have got it in the first place? So I think making the time and the space to interrogate our practices, and as you said, Erica, the gaps, the silences, the things that aren't there, that they speak volumes as well.
I think too, just quickly from a really kind of practical side, this has to be a sector-wide and institution-wide shift, and so involve all employees. Don't just put fixing the situation on especially on Indigenous employees' shoulders, or on the person responsible for diversity. And definitely management support has to be there.
Thank you all so much. That lots of food for thought. I think, again, some key themes coming out here really is that normalization of the archives, the museum, the archaeological, the GLAM sector as a normative. White supremacy is kind of the normative underpinnings, and that really that the work that we're talking about is the work. It's not an additional, if you have time to address decolonizing, it really is foundationally, fundamentally the work that we need to do if we're going to move forward. So thank you. I'm looking at our time, and we have one more question, or it's kind of a two-parter. We've started to unpick it and talk about it. So after I read it, maybe what I could do is invite each of you to address the question in any way you'd like, but also any final remarks you'd like or thoughts you'd like to share, to make sure that we can hold time to have a proper acknowledgement. Thank you at the end. This has been just an exciting conversation. I'm really glad Kristen had the foresight to give us 3 parts so we can keep talking. So our final question, it's a 2-parter, so bear with me. How has the GLAM sector pondered history of colonial appropriation and cultural restitution? So again, I think you're starting to unpick that here, but I think it's interesting to kind of continue on that idea of that I love that word pondered. So really, how has it really looked at historical history of colonial appropriation, or is it looking at that and the restitution part? And then secondly, what are specific work experiences, professional experience, personal experiences that you've had or been a part of that have been impactful to this change? So again, you started to share these as institutional things or other things you've been doing, but what are some of the things, or maybe some things that again you'd like to see happening or you're a part of continuing to grow? So, and again, any final thoughts as we make our way around the group would be more than welcome. Thank you.
I'll unmute myself first and then I'll jump in. Something that I was thinking about was in terms of acknowledgement of the colonial origins of archives within on archival websites. So there's a number of websites that I've come across, a few in Canada, a lot more in the United States, that addresses language. So archives is very language based. And so one positive shift so far has been to acknowledge that the language used in archival descriptions are often very colonial, racist. A terminology is used and they can cause additional harm to our patrons. And so aside from looking at, redescription, aside from incorporating, the history of the use of racist language in descriptions within the finding aid, which is a whole other task, just acknowledging that this exists and is a potential source of harm for people, I think is is a good step. I think it's an important step. The Archives of Australia website actually has a disclaimer on their website when you first pull it up that talks about, please be aware that there is sensitive, images and text within here. And so as you go in, you are forewarned to put your guard up. And so I think that is important because the information within the records held by archives can be incredibly damaging to one's own mental emotional state. So yeah, that's one area where archives are looking at their colonial underpinnings and then still moving forward in a way that's doable. Redescription is huge. It needs to be kind of looked at, but it's a whole other task.
I am going to start talking and have no idea if I'll answer either of the questions. But I was thinking, just in terms of what keeps me here, how do I handle the challenges and kind of the ups and downs and emotions and stuff of being in the sector or these sectors, and working here as an Indigenous person. And yeah, I think a number of things have been mentioned already. So like having that peer support, being able to talk, know you have other Indigenous people in the professions you can talk with, knowing that when you're walking into a primarily white space, you have both other Indigenous peers and also allies there, working at an institution that allows you to be Indigenous, but doesn't expect you as the Indigenous person to fix everything. And also recognizing where I work now recognizes, yes, your indigeneity. So we have as employees get 5 days of cultural leave that we can use every year. So in the past, I've used it for dance and performances. I'm planning on using it next year to go up north and do fish for a week. And also, just practically the way we identify family in our bereavement leave is wider than just kind of parents, children. So just that, I guess, things that let me be more myself here in this profession. Those are things that keep me here.
Yeah, those are two very big questions. For some reason, my mind went to this idea of pondering colonial history. I think that has been, I guess, as Melissa has touched on and we've kind of talked about already, that needs to be a parallel process of attending to the past, but also thinking of making concrete steps in the present, so that it's not only looking, being oh, this is what we've done and this is what we've inherited, but yeah, more about how do we deal with that. And I think one thing, one thing that I think more work needs to be done in terms of looking at museum history is just the large amount of collections in institutions, both locally and around the world, that have been so disconnected and severed from their origins, that thinking about the absence in archives and museums around the metadata, and all the work that needs to be done to make those reconnections, to better understand how museums and collecting institutions came into possession of these things, because I think that's a critical step in terms of the potentials of repatriation, if that's what communities want. But it's we need to know what's out there, who it's connected to be able to take those steps forward. And so I think, yeah, more resources and time and energy needs to be committed to doing that type of work. And again, like that, I feel like a big part of that too is like, through the relationship building that we've talked about, that, I feel like to just kind of like reiterate what has already been said, like I feel like institutions, whether they be universities or museums, still in many ways operate in like a very like capitalist way in terms of like rushing towards deliverables and products. And yeah, as was discussed earlier, like prioritizing relationships and process over product. So that's one of the things that I feel like I've kind of try to remind myself in the work that I do, and what is has been something I've learned through my work engaging with Musqueam is like that sense of time and that sense of respect to different ways of working that isn't so like rushed towards a particular endpoint, if that makes sense. And so I feel like those are some of the steps to take moving forward. That's all I have to say right now.
I'll try to keep this quick. I feel like this whole discussion could be like weeks long. I think one of the things that, as you're talking about getting institutions to reflect on timelines and deliverables and things like that, institutions that have multiple collections like ours does, or other museums that have both natural and human history. I think there needs to be at management level, at finance level, reflection on how much money has been made off of the possession of Indigenous material, and starting to reflect on not just giving natural history the same as Indigenous history, but starting to reflect on what needs to be, where the funding really needs to go to support the work that's done, and really examining what the depth and breadth of that work is. For all the reasons that all of you have stated, and for a million other reasons, I think this work that all of us do is just so nuanced and so multi-layered that it can't just be about short governmental timelines or short exhibit timelines anymore. And I feel like I'm not going to at all touch on all the things that I'm thinking in my head, but I'll leave it there for the sake of this. Thanks.
Thank you all so very much. I feel, as you said, we've surfaced a number of key things here that will continue in the coming conversations, and you've been generously sharing your time and thoughts and expertise and experiences. I think we just have so much gratitude for you taking the time today to share with us. Thank you everyone for joining us. I do apologize, we've gone a couple of minutes over, but I think it's important as we talk about structuring our systems and unpacking, the frames that universities and institutions put us in, that we take the time to do it well and give everyone time to speak. So I'd also like to remind everyone that this webinar is part of a 3-part series. So the next one will be on October 28th, and we'll examine the ideology of decolonization as a current movement in museums and archives. This webinar will reflect more on the current activities surrounding decolonizing museums and archives today, rather than providing concrete answers again, as we've talked about today. The 3rd webinar will be on November 18th, and this is where, again, thank you so much for sharing your questions. It will be an opportunity for experts to come back together and to really unpack and share a number of the questions that have been asked today, and we anticipate being asked in the 2nd series. So continue to share your questions with us. There's a link on the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, irshdc.ubc.ca, that we will continue to share the resources that have been mentioned and shared. We'll start to collate those. Kim Lawson very kindly shared a link for the Native American protocols in the chat today. We'll be gathering all of those as well as a number of the things the panelists have mentioned, and share a continuing resource in the series that can be shared in the community of practice we're building here. You can also send your questions to the dialogue email, dialogue@irhsdc.ubc.ca. Again, that will be online. You can follow the links. So again, I thank you all so very much for generously sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you for everyone who participated. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in October on the 28th. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.